This is the UH-1 Iroqouis, also known as the Huey because UH-1. And it's a great example of an aircraft that went from the design board to the manufacturing plant and then into service with very little changes and not a lot of hiccups. They kind of got it right from the start. It's had a few modifications, like the power plant, but generally speaking, it's pretty much as it was back when it was first made in the 60s, and they're still making them now. And to be fair, while some of the modifications, like the engine being uprated from 700 brake horsepower to 1400 brake horsepower, some of those things were done, to improve the design and the capability of the aircraft. A lot of the actual changes and adaptations to the design were mostly down to just making it specialise into certain service requirements. For example, they started making them entirely out of aluminium, and part of that was because the USMC wanted to be able to use them for ship launches, and that meant they needed something that was very corrosion resistant. So making it as an entire aluminium frame made it much more resistant in that highly corrosive atmosphere. They also added a rotor brake, because one of the issues with landing on a ship is you want to stop it having spinning blades as quickly as you can. It's fine if you're in the army and you're just landing it on the field and you can just let it spin down in its own time. But if you're on a ship, you want to slow it down. So they added a rotor brake. And there was a couple of little other adaptations and changes, but generally speaking, they didn't do a lot to it. It came out and they went, yeah, that works, and it's just done its job ever since. One of the things that made this aircraft so versatile was the fact that you could reconfigure it to suit the job role you wanted. Now, unlike the Russians with their Hind, it wasn't designed for a quick turnaround. You kind of set it up for a job and then you had to kind of stick with that job for a bit. But you could reconfigure these from utility helicopters into troop carrying helicopters, into medevac helicopters, into even attack helicopters, where you could fit pinions on the side to put weaponry on the outside, like rocket pods and machine guns and so on, so that you could adapt this into various different roles. And you had the advantage of all of those roles could then be on a common platform, which meant that your supply chain and your maintenance fixtures were a lot easier to manage. So you weren't trying to maintain completely different aircraft for all these different roles. And then later on in its service life, this was adapted into the AH-1, which is essentially the same helicopter, but just with a reconfigured crew compartment. So you lose this bit at the back where you can stick some extra soldiers to carry, and you have a tandem part at the front. So the pilot and the gunner, in that case, go in a tandem formation. But essentially, it's the same helicopter, just with a different crew bit at the bottom. And again, it means that you've got that consistent supply chain, so you can have AH-1 dedicated attack helicopters, you can have these doing medevac and doing utility work, and you still got a lot of commonality in the parts and supply chain to keep them all in the air. Now, this aircraft first saw service in 1962 in the Vietnam War, which is probably the one that most people would associate it with because it was so heavily used. They sent 7,000 of these out to Vietnam, and only about 3,500 came back, because in Vietnam they were learning about helicopter warfare. And one of the things you learn very quickly and brutally is that helicopters are very susceptible to small arms fire. So they lost a lot of these. But that said, these were a huge tactical advantage. The whole concept of air cavalry came around because of this particular platform. Of course, the US military and several other people who used to run these have now replaced them with the UH-60s, and it follows a similar ethos of being a common platform that's then adapted into various roles, like the AH-60 as well, the Black Hawk, the Nighthawk, and so on. But that said, this is still in service in a lot of countries, and it's still being built under license in several places. So it's a hell of a testament to an aircraft that even, 60 years plus after it came into service, is still going and is still being built. And to be fair, from attack helicopters to utilities to medevac and all those various roles that are now filled by helicopters in the military, it was this airframe that probably learned most of the hard lessons that made those the successful platforms they are now. This is the granddaddy of helicopter warfare.